Hey, it's a busy holiday week, and during this week, we are bringing you a look back at some of the most compelling stories and conversations we've covered for you in 2024. It's 24 in review.
This is the Hidden Killers Podcast with Tony Brueski.
Featuring defense attorney, Hidden Killers daily contributor, and host of the Defense Diaries podcast, Bob Motta.
Scott Peterson making headlines again, this time with the L.A. Innocence Project taking up the case and the conversation, saying, hey, there's some new potential evidence here that, well, maybe it'll help Scott Peterson. Maybe it'll point to some innocence, if there is any to be found. Joining me to discuss, host of the podcast Defense Diaries, Bob Motta, defense attorney. Bob, you're a defense attorney. You can take this from that angle of, it's Scott Peterson. A lot of people have already said, and have judged him, and so has the courts, of being guilty. But is there room? Is there anything to this with the L.A. Innocence Project taking up the case and saying, hey, we should take a look at this closer?
Yeah. I mean, anytime you get in, like any of the Innocence Projects, and, you and I were talking, we want to make a distinction. It's not the Innocence Project, but I believe that it's in the network of Innocence Projects. There's Innocence Projects all across the country. Obviously, kind of the main one can't take on every case, and they get 65,000. They currently have 65,000 letters that they're trying to pour through, trying to figure out which cases. And they vet their cases, I think all of them do, maybe to different degrees. But I think typically they're not going to jump into a case if they feel it's completely fruitless. So, they must have felt that there was something there, and based on what I've seen with respect to the pleadings, it seems to be revolving around this burnt out van that they happen to find about a mile away from the Peterson's home.
Yeah.
That had blood in it, and they're asking the courts and they think that it could be connected. And it was found the day after Lacey went disappeared, so who knows? Yeah. I to be honest with you, when I first heard about it, I was more, I wouldn't say optimistic, but I thought it may have had a better chance of succeeding when I thought that it was related to the van that the burglars that Lacey is supposedly to have happened upon while she was walking the dog.
Sure.
Who I always thought, I thought that was a viable explanation. It's like Nancy Grace didn't, but I did.
Sure.
It's like Nancy Grace really flamed through Scott Peterson.
Yeah, right away. The verdict was in with Nancy, but yeah.
Oh, man, no question. And, he was a philandering piece of shit. Yeah. There's no question about that. Not trying to make him into a good guy, but him being a bad husband, a terrible husband, an awful husband. Yeah. Not necessarily make him a murderer. Sure. That never swayed me. I never, but, I do this for a living. So, the way that they couch defendants in the press and even the state does it, where they equate him being awful in one respect, then turns him into something else. And that's just not always true. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. I think you have to really kind of dig into the facts there. So, it's interesting, man. I'm certainly going to follow it. I certainly want to know. So, yeah, I'll clearly be following it. I'm anxious to see where this goes. And basically, they're at the juncture where they have to convince a judge that there's enough there that the judge is going to allow them to do the DNA testing. Like a PCRA, which is a Post-Conviction Relief Act petition, is not a fishing expedition. They have to have some receipts. They have to come with some receipts beyond just like, we think that this might be something that might be important. That's not the purpose of a Post-Conviction Relief Act, and typically when you're coming with those, they're very late in the process. He's typically gone through the appellate process in full, his direct appeals. He's appealed it up to the Supreme Court, been denied all through that process. And now typically when you can bring a probable cause or a PCRA, you're going to have new evidence, newly discovered evidence. That's the kind of the key to it. And it's got to be legitimate, and it's got to be compelling. So the question of whether or not the court is going to find that compelling is another question. And who's to say that Scott Peterson didn't use that van, even if it were Lacey's blood.
Sure. I mean, and that doesn't. Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing. I mean, it's are we pretty much, is this all hinging on that van and that appearance of what might be blood in it? Like, once we know the answer to that, if there is either of their DNA, either of their blood in that, and blood and DNA are two different things, but if it is there, then there seems to be, there might be something to it. If it's not, though, is it really just a big nothing burger?
Yeah, essentially. I mean, and just so people understand, I mean, blood contains DNA.
Yes.
Or it can. It's an organic or it's biological material. So, I mean, that's what they're hoping to test. They're hoping to test the blood that was in there to see if there is a usable sample.
What do we know about this? And why now? Why 20 years later are we suddenly paying attention to a van that appears to have had blood in it? I mean, where was this back then? Was this looked over? Was this were they unaware that this existed? I guess that's the question. That's gonna
have to be the case, because if it was available to the defense, and we're talking about Mark Garagos back then, like if it was in the discovery, if it was there and existed and he just missed it, it's not newly discovered.
Yeah.
So it would have had to have been something where Peterson, doing his own pleadings over the course of many years, was in a situation where, he ran into, maybe he was doing FOIA requests, maybe he ran into it, maybe, whatever he found or the Innocence Project found in terms of getting to the point where they said, we'll take a look at the case, was a situation. See my cleaning people creeping back. You'll have to cut that part, man.
Let's leave it. For those of us listening on audio, there's a video
with the mop.
There's a video version of this on YouTube. If you're just listening to the podcast, if you'd like to see the animated version of our conversation here today.
Yeah. So like something triggered the Innocence Project to want to look into it, and they clearly know whether or not they're going to make the argument, or they'll be able to make the argument that it is in fact newly discovered. If it was there and it existed and was ignored, that doesn't constitute newly discovered evidence. So we have to assume that there's an argument in place that it was in fact newly discovered, and maybe they were doing FOIA requests for around the area, and then they came upon this police report and said, "Hey, man, a mile away from the house, burnt out van, blood in it. Let's take a look."
Sure.
Maybe, so we'll see how it goes. I mean, it's a long shot.
It is.
Let me put it that way. You know, it's like I said, I was far more intrigued when I thought that it was related to the burglars that Lacey allegedly had seen, because that was always kind of the only other concept to me that may have made sense, and I know a lot of people with respect to that Peterson case, because they really didn't have much evidence against him. They had a lot of things that looked bad, a lot, but it was all, but it was all through the lens of he's a cheater. Yeah. And, he's like, it's like, so that makes it all, it clouds it a little bit, that he's going out to the marina, that morning, and he's got the anchors, which is not unusual for a boat owner to make cement anchors. I mean, it's just not.
But it's also a bit unusual, though, if you don't know how to fish for the fish you're claiming you're fishing for. Him claiming he was fishing for sturgeon, which, you're up in Chicago. I'm assuming you know what sturgeon are. I'm from Wisconsin. They're a specific type of fish, and you don't catch them with a line. That's not how that works.
They're very prehistoric.
Yeah, they're basically dinosaur fish. They can be more than 100 years old. My dad fishes for them in Wisconsin every year. And it's not, you don't go out on the boat and catch them like that. That's just not how that works. I mean, so either, he's just a really dumb, but again, doesn't make him a murderer, could just be a really idiotic fisherman too. I mean, he's not the brightest guy, it seems, in a lot of senses. So again, looks weird, but that's always the case. There's always something very close on this case where it's like, not quite, but...
Like my whole thing with the boat has always been, he's in a small boat. And when you're in marinas like that, especially like in that area, you're going to have a lot of very large boats. So, the concept that he had Laci's remains in that boat, and like the witnesses who saw him in the boat wouldn't have seen something that looked unusual, because they're going to have a vantage point where they're looking down into his small boat. I don't know. Like it's one of those cases that we'll probably never know the truth, and at this point he's convicted. So,
well, if the evidence,
see how it plays out, man.
Exactly. If the evidence is there, then we'll see how it plays out and the right things will happen. If it's not, then it's simply not.
Want to listen ad-free? Want advanced access to all of our interviews before anyone else?
Become a True Crime Today Premium Plus subscriber on Apple Podcasts.
You get every episode commercial-free.
So you can binge on true crime
until you can binge no more.
Search True Crime Today Premium Plus on Apple Podcasts now, or go to our podcast page and sign up now.
More of the Hidden Killers podcast next.